Usually, people know me. I work a lot on, and I did for the Secretary of State on trying a hopeful topic of peace, Israel, Palestinians, and other issues. But as of late, I've been spending a lot of time on the Syria conflict, and it's just it's a gloomier kind of topic, but it's the topic for tonight, and it could not be sadly more timely. I was just looking at my Twitter feed before I went on tonight because the president announced that there would be a U.S. attack on Syria after the chemical strike yesterday. So I didn't know when we booked this with Ed and Beth months ago. We didn't know how grim of a reminder would be of this conflict that we just saw last night. So I'm going to try to. My kind of focus tonight is to really bring a dimension of this conflict, because this is like a strategic maze. It's a problem from hell, which I'll explain the Syria conflict. I'm just going to look at a slice of it, but to try to see how it relates to the broader conflict. And that is the whole issue of my fear, and anyone knows me knows David's not an alarmist, certainly not a warmonger. If anything, he tries to be more optimistic. My concern that there could be a war within a war, basically, between Israel and Iran and its proxies in 2018. If I had to put it in percentage terms, I was just in Israel and I met with, I would say 7 of the top military leaders there. I would say that it's not yet a 50%, but it's getting close. And things got a little worse since I had these talks earlier this year of 2018. So I want to explain why I have this concern of a war between Israel and Iranian proxies in Syria. But I think to do that well, hopefully, I need to really explain why, and I know many of you follow the news, but why there are all these different conflicts in one conflict, why I call it the problem from hell. The Vegas rules don't apply to Syria. What happens there stays there. We've seen close to a million refugees come from Syria into Europe as a result of this conflict is just one piece of it. But I want to try to disentangle the strands of spaghetti for those of you who don't follow all the nuances, and then get to what this means for Israel going forward, and are there ways to avert it? That's kind of what I want to do, and then hopefully answer your questions in a discussion if we have time. So I would say first you got to start with, the mega conflict is clearly Bashar Al Assad, who is the leader of the Alawites, an offshoot of the Shia, and they represent about 12% of Syria. Syria traditionally is a majority Sunni. I think it's around 75, 77%. There's some Druze and Kurds and others there, but it's been a minority regime led by his dad, Hafez Al Assad, who those of you who follow the Arab-Israeli conflict know Hafez Al Assad was a very pivotal figure, fought wars with Israel, 67, 73. 67 he wasn't exactly president, but he was almost. And then he died in 2000. There were peace talks in the 90s that didn't work, but he always viewed Hezbollah as this proxy force that could make Israel bleed, because he thought Israel was more dominating, but he ruled Syria with an iron fist. And now his son, and this comes out of the Godfather movie, who thought that he was out of the family business. He was an ophthalmologist in London, but when his brother is killed in a car crash, he is brought back to Syria, and when his father dies, he becomes the leader. And he has told the Alawites, our backs are against the wall, we're only 12%. Unless we're ruthless, we can't survive here. And he, in order to survive, has tried to bring in, different patrons of the cause. And he felt he needed Hezbollah, who his dad cultivated since it was really started in 1983. But Hezbollah, in a certain way, has gotten stronger than Syria itself in many ways as a hardened fighting force. And he was always close with its patron, the Iranians being Shia. The rest, if you remember the Iran-Iraq War of the 80s, all the Arabs lined up with Iraq. Only one lined up with Iran. Who was the one? Syria, because they were not Sunni, they were Shia, Alawite, an offshoot of the Shia. So he's always had a close relationship with Iran, the family has, and he's always had a relationship with Russia. The Soviet Union. There's a famous anecdote of Assad and George H.W. Bush right after Bush left office, and he visited Damascus in '93, and H.W. Bush 41 was saying how great Gorbachev was, and he said Gorbachev, Assad Hafiz said, is the worst person possible because when he was before him, the Soviets were a superpower. He tried to let some air in, some breeze in, and he opened the window and he got knocked over. And he destroyed his country, the Soviet Union. And now it's just, it's destroying me. So he doesn't have fond memories of Gorbachev. But all these were his allies. In 2015, Bashar, it looked like he might lose. And the Iranians came to Moscow and they said, Bashar is going down unless you come and do something about it, and we're willing to help out. This was Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Revolutionary Guards, and in Iran, that is kind of the arm of the regime and expanding its influence in Iran, in the Middle East. And apparently he did not even get the full clearance of the Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader of Iran, who is actually risk averse when it comes to Iranian casualties. He will fight to the last Hezbollah militant, but he doesn't want to sacrifice his own people. But the combination of the Russian Air Force, led by Putin, and having the Hezbollah as the foot soldiers, and then having the idea of the Iranians having this idea that of like a Shia foreign legion of sorts. We're going to get people into Syria from Pakistan, Afghanistan, not just Arabs, but Muslims, and they're going to fight. And that has always been Iran. Part of the genius of the Iranians is to identify proxies. And so if it's Hezbollah or these Shia proxy forces, up there you see the Iranian proxy, the Sunni movement in the Middle East does not have anything comparable to what the Iranians have. It's a total mismatch. It's asymmetrical because the Iranians understood the importance of proxies, that they're tied to Iran organizationally, financially, and ideologically. And if they identify with Iran's mission and spreading of Iran's influence, the Sunnis don't have any proxies. I don't consider ISIS a proxy or Al-Qaeda a proxy. They just chop off people's heads. But the Sunni don't have it. And the Iranians are able to let others die for them. So basically, 2015, they were going down, and Qasem Soleimani convinces Putin, you're gonna have to come in if we're gonna save Mr. Assad, Dr. Assad, and you're gonna fight to salvage his rule. And so it was the Russian Air Force, no foot soldiers, but the Russian Air Force and these proxy groups, Hezbollah on the ground, the Shia, Foreign Legion, however you want to call them, on the ground, working with the Syrian army, which was beleaguered because they'd been fighting now for years. But this gave him a whole new second wind. And having Russia come back to the Middle East, Russia had not been in the Middle East in any significant way since the 1970s. They've been providing aid, military arms in the 80s. But when the Soviet Union, in the 90s, they said, we're not called the Soviet Union, we want people to pay for these weapons, then no one wanted it anymore. But so now in 2015, Putin is back. And so that's kind of the main effort. And he turned the course of the war, Putin, with Bashar, with Hezbollah, with the Iranian proxies, with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. It was a winning combination, but it was ruthless. And what we just saw last night with Syria taking barrel bombs from helicopters and dumping them on people and killing kids and stuff. Let's see if we have let's see, I don't know. Okay, just so you know, so the Damascus area, if you see the pointer, that's the capital. And here's Lebanon, right? Israel's down here. The Golan here, the Jordan is here, Saudi is here. And where Assad cares the most about is obviously his capital, but he cares about the coastal area here. The Banyas, Latakia is a big area. There's also a Russian port here. And a lot of the fighting Homs, Hama, Idlib, Aleppo, they call this essential Syria because that's where the most of the population is. And a lot over here, which I'm going to get to in a moment, is eastern Syria, east of the Euphrates, that has a few key cities, but the bulk of the Syrian is here. What Assad wanted the most is, I want to win here. I want to win, here's the base, and I want to obviously win Damascus and northwards on these key roads and the Mediterranean coast. That was his main objective. And he was brutal, but he was able to do that. Now we'll see if the U.S. attack, tonight or tomorrow morning, when it comes, is it going to really degrade his ability to drop these barrel bombs of chlorine and sarin gas, and that have killed, now they talk about dozens, and a lot of them are kids. So we don't know. We assume that any U.S. effort will want to have some tie-in to the nerve gas attack. Now, that's only, though, one of the conflicts. Another one that's gotten American attention in particular has been ISIS. And you've been following that. The center of the caliphate has been in Raqqa. There's also been here, let's just see if we have here. They were also in northern Iraq, in western Iraq, in here. So eastern Syria, western Iraq. And for the United States, western Iraq is important because the Sunnis that would be hostile to, on one hand, hostile to Bashar, but when the Iraqi government was weakened, they were able to take a lot of the western area, the Sunni extremists from fellow Sunnis, but the U.S. and the coalition has pushed them out of western Iraq and northern Iraq. Here, Mosul, here's the Kurdish area, and has been perpetuating the war, really persecuting it to try to eliminate ISIS altogether as a caliphate, as a geographic center. Now, just to be clear, ISIS isn't really disappearing because they're online, and this whole self-radicalization, if someone goes on YouTube and watches ISIS videos, that's going to probably exist whether they have a capital in in Raqqa or not. But the U.S. has been really eliminating them. A lot of the fighting has been here at Abu Kamal, Maidan, Deir el-Zur has been a big place. I wrote an essay for the New Yorker magazine on Israel's attack on the Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007. A lot of that has been now cleared by the Israeli censor. It was a lot of fun writing that in terms of, but I got to tell you, the fact checkers at the New Yorker, it's like a mental colonoscopy. It's like something you've never experienced. Although for me, I felt my facts were unassailable, so I wasn't worried, but that was an experience in and of itself. Anyway, that's a whole other topic. But what's happened is this third conflict is up here, and that is between Turks, right, Turkey, and the Kurds. Now, those of you who've been following the Kurds, it's been a really sad story. The Kurds, because they're in Iraq, they're in Turkey, they're in Syria, they're in Iran, they're in different places. Each country's afraid if there's an independent Kurdistan, they're going to take off a chunk of our country. So there's been this coalition of countries always to deny the Kurds a state. And the people have been persecuted no less than the Jews, I would say, in terms of being denied a state of the Kurds. It's a real injustice. But what's happened now is that the Turks are convinced that the Kurds are getting a lot of power because this whole east of the Euphrates zone, you've got 2,000 American special forces here. And you could say 2,000 is not a lot, but the United States is the United States, the reputation of the world's leading superpower to be there. Who are our proxies as Americans? You know, we don't have proxies really, but the people who've been helping us fight ISIS more than anyone, I would say, are the Kurds. But what's happened is, and I know this maybe is not on the cover of the newspapers that much, but you know, I just ran a whole event at the Washington Institute of Americans and Israelis and Arabs. I feel it was a landmark event for us. I can't get into details given who were the participants. I can't really discuss it. This is the second run I've done on Syria, about 16 hours of discussions. And I could say that, you know, we had a senior State Department official who came and said, look, you know, we've got ISIS on the ropes, but guess what? The war is stalled because our Kurdish friends are not fighting with us now because there's a whole Turkish-Kurdish border issues here in different places because the Turks are convinced that we're going to help the Kurds set up a state, and they want to disrupt that. And so our war on ISIS has basically been put on hold during these last 6 weeks or so until the Kurds know what's going on with the Turks, if there's going to be fighting on that northern area. So that's another conflict inside Syria. And then I mentioned the fourth area, of course, is the Russia return to the Middle East and how that has scrambled things. And I'm going to return to Russia because it's played a huge role on the Israeli element. That you've got Prime Minister Netanyahu, I don't know if many of you know this, has made 7 trips to Moscow and Sochi to the dock of Putin in 2015. He's made more trips to Russia than he's made to America. It's the first time ever for any Israeli leader. But having Russia now kind of in charge of the skies of Syria, for Israel changes a lot of calculations, and I'm going to talk about that. So what I want to say here is, now I want to get you to the Israel piece of this. And Israel, until now, I would say till recently, the Israeli military establishment has internalized the lessons of 1982, the Lebanon War, where Ariel Sharon thought he could crown Bashir Gemayel as the leader of Lebanon. It was really an audacious move by Israel in Beirut the summer of '82, and it left a scar. I mean, because Bashir Gemayel was blown up by Syrians and Hezbollah types. Certainly the Hezbollah people attacked 241 American Marines were killed in 1983. And if you ask the Israeli defense establishment, what's your takeaway from '82? The takeaway from '82 goes like this. It's very hard to social engineer an Arab country if you're a Jewish state. That's the takeaway. And while people always think of Israel and chutzpah, you know, audacity, as kind of interchangeable terms, the truth is that I would argue that the Israeli defense establishment is much more humble about its own abilities, where it could change, what are the limits on the use of force, than people on the outside are about them. They want people to see them as tough because they want the deterrent capacity. But they're the first ones to tell you, this is what we can do and this is what we can't do. And what we can't do is we can't social engineer an Arab state. And I think it was actually to the credit and while I don't agree with Netanyahu on every point here on the Palestinian issue, I think he played this one pretty good. He played pretty well in saying, look, if Israel's not going to be decisive in this fight, whether Bashar prevails, doesn't prevail in that Syrian civil war, again, horrific numbers. You're talking, the documents are only a 500,000 killed, but I was in Brussels at the European Union where they go, look, we stopped counting at a certain point. We really think the number's closer to 1 million people killed. 12 million, displaced. Some to Jordan, right, in the south. Some to Lebanon here in the west. Some to Turkey in the north. I mentioned 1 million to Europe. And some just moved inside Syria. 12 million. I mean, the numbers are so huge, it's hard for the mind to get around them. The biggest, I would say maybe with the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, where 1 million were killed, this and that would these are the worst two humanitarian disasters in the modern Middle East, I think, certainly in the last 100 years. So we're living through it now. You're going to be able to tell your grandchildren or whatever, I lived through this, because we're going to feel the reverberations of this stuff for decades, because putting Humpty Dumpty back together is not going to be easy. So the Israeli approach was, if we cannot be decisive in an outcome, stay out. And the military wants to stay out because, like I said, they've learned you can't internalize, you cannot social engineer an Arab country. So Israel has basically said, we're going to keep it simple. And it goes like this. If they fired us, we'll fire back, because we got to keep a sense of deterrent. Now, often these are errant shells, mortar shells and stuff like that. And if Hezbollah, because they are extracting a lot of political capital from this war, and they tell, Bashar, pay up, we want to take some of the weaponry, and I'm going to talk about some of it, this Iranian land bridge that goes to a place like Abu Kamal, and they want to go take weapons through Syria into Beirut, their headquarters, so they can use it against Israel. They've got about 120,000 rockets, which I'll get back to in a minute. So Israel's other view is, look, we want to stay out of the war, but we don't want the good stuff that, that Iran is transmitting via Syria into Lebanon. If we see it, we're going to shoot at it. We're going to disrupt Hezbollah's weapon supply. But that's it. Otherwise, we're out of this war. And what Israel did, I thought, which is one of the most brilliant moves, and it hasn't gotten a lot of play, is, and I talked to some of the generals who started this, and it was a brilliant thing, which is set up medical field hospitals. It's really smart, because you make friends when you set up medical facilities, on the Syrian border. Because Israel's fear was, when everything is going to hell in the handbasket, who are your friends? Who are the villages across the way? Can you help them out? What about food? What about their injuries? They want to go to Israeli hospitals. I know it sounds shocking, because the Arabs always saw the Israelis as the devils. But they heard Israel's got good hospitals in places like Haifa, Rambam, and other ones, in Tzfat, and places like that. So what basically the Israeli army said, the best thing we could do is, how to win friends, influence people? Set up medical field hospitals. And that is paid in spades for Israel. I thought it was brilliant, which is keep the border area quiet, because you'll know the Mukhtar, they'll get people through the fence. There's been thousands and thousands of Syrians treated in Israeli hospitals, and Israel got good intel on these neighboring villages, because Israel didn't want to go into the war anyway, but wants to find, would rather make sure you got friends on the border. I think it was a brilliant move. So far, so good. So if everything's so good, what's the problem? Here's the problem. Now Israel's looking at the post-war. It's like no longer the war. It's saying, okay, tell me, what am I peering at? What am I staring down at? What's coming? It's like Bashar has won. The world doesn't want to admit that he won, because he's a butcher and he gasses his own people. But who's dislodging this guy from his capital? Nobody. And so the Israeli view is, oh my God, he's won in the war. He's won. He's secured his power base. And now the Iranians are going to come for their pound of flesh, so to speak, to say, okay, we were with you. Now what do we get out of it? This is what we want. We would love to have Iranian naval ports on the Mediterranean, okay? And the best way to do it is we'll do it right a mile away from the Russian port of Tartus, because the Israelis, and the Iranians are right about this, the Israelis don't want to mess with the Russians. So if we build next to the Russians, the Israelis can't bomb us. And the same with the airfield, a place called Hamimim, that the Russians have established. So basically, Israel is saying the Iranians want to entrench themselves in Syria in a way with military infrastructure. They have other places. There's a place called Masyaf. I don't see it around here. It's not far from Homs, I think. And they're doing one there, and they're doing one in Lebanon, precision-guided facilities. Now, this might sound to you like maybe with an iPhone, Apple, you could do this. It's not such high tech. But you've got 120,000 rockets. But if you want to upgrade a rocket to become a smart missile, to get within 10 meters of precision-guided location, you've got to equip that. Because Israel keeps intercepting rockets coming through off this Iranian land bridge. But imagine if you could produce, for Hezbollah and convert their rockets into missiles in Lebanon, in Syria, and then you're in a different place. So the Iranian infrastructures, and put other missiles there too. Israel fears what it's looking at is stereo. It's looking at stereo. The stereo is, if there's a next war with Lebanon, it's not just Lebanon. It's the north. It's Lebanon and Syria. Because Hezbollah is in both places now, not just one. So, Israel's fought 2 wars in Lebanon, but what if the third Lebanon war is not a war with Lebanon alone, but Hezbollah in stereo, taking these rockets, turning them into missiles in both of these locations. So what's changed Israel's thinking is a belief that so long as it was a war, stay out. But if it's a war that's pivoting to a post-war, and Iran is going to collect because, hey, we got you elected, elected. We fought for you to win this war, and we took all the heat. Now you got to give us what we want. We want to set up shop on Israel's doorstep. And we want the Israelis to start being squeezed on both countries, both Lebanon and Syria. That's the game. And that's why this has gotten so much more complicated. So Israel's point is, again, just to be clear, is avoid regime change because it's too big for Israel. A Jewish state can't change, social engineer an Arab country. There are Arabs who want Israel to lead it. They go, how can we lead it? We're Jews. No, how are we going to change that? That's not up to us. We can only deal with a slice of this, and that is the Iranian dimension to it. So it's the port, no Iranian port, no airfields, no military infrastructure, no proxies near the border in the south, and this is kind of Israel's red lines, if you ask me. Those are the things Israel cares about. That Iran gets a concession for a new mining phosphate, that's fine. They're not going to, they're not. But my fear is that Iran and Israel are kind of on a collision course there because they're all for this piece of Syria. Again, Israel doesn't want to stay there. They just want to deny it to the Iranians. Their view is, look, Assad, we might hate you, but you're the leader. If you want to extend your rule from Damascus to other parts of Syria, we can't stop you. But if you come with this Shia Foreign Legion and the Hezbollah and Iranians, and you're setting up shop, you're not just setting up shop as the Syrian government, but you're setting up shop with all these folks together, this is a different story. And you're putting Iran on our doorstep. They're not supposed to be on our doorstep because they're supposed to be over here, right? They're supposed to be here. They're not supposed to be here. Here's Israel, here and here. And that's why it's gotten complicated. So what does this mean for the United States? And here I think you see differences between the president and some of his national security team, although the national security team is changing, and so it's flux. But basically the president says, okay, he says, I want to, well, I can't use a word in a public talk, what he actually said, but you could imagine what he said, what he wants to kick the bleep out of ISIS. Okay, but he said, he keeps saying, we're winning. I think today he said, we won. He said, we're going to, he said in a campaign thing in Ohio last week, we're almost out. The generals, on the other hand, people like McMaster, was national security advisor until today, replaced by John Bolton, said, you know what, I don't know who's going to fill this vacuum, probably the Iranians. Let's not leave so fast unless we know what we're turning it over to. And Mattis, who's been more focused on North Korea, I think has been of that view too. And he was actually the first to say, well, maybe we'll stick around. Also, if there ever is peace talks on ending the stalemate, having the U.S. having a foothold in Syria might give the U.S. some skin in the game. But the question is the United States being east here, all the way down to here, does that mean, and Trump has given speeches, we're gonna beat back the Iranians, we're gonna hit Iran, but he says that, but at the same time he says we're getting out. So what is it? Is it the way Trump says, getting out? Is it like the generals say, we're still there? But I think what's safe to say is Israel's on its own. I mean, that is certainly my conclusion after running these dialogues, which I unfortunately cannot reveal too much about. But I could just say that I think that basically the U.S. view is if we're going to try to stop the Iranians, maybe we could do it in western Iraq because that's Sunni there, and there's a lot of allies of the United States. We fought a war in Iraq, but we're only going to do what we have to do. But we're not going to expand. If Israel wants to hit the precision-guided areas in Syria, wants to make sure that these Shia proxies don't come close to the Israeli border, wants to stop this land bridge of Iran, that's going to be up to Israel. Israel's on its own. That is my conclusion where things are. Now, what could change the dynamic? Well, if the United States tells Russia, that is the kind of arbiters, and some people think that Trump is like subcontracted Syria to Putin. That's kind of the way the perception is, that, if he says, listen, you don't want a war because you're friends with the Israelis and you want to be friends with the Iranians. If there's a war, you're going to have to choose sides. And we don't think Putin wants a war in Syria between Israel and Iran because it pits him in the middle. And this gets us to the whole question of what is Russia's interest and what are the Russian-Iranian, where are the convergences and where are the divergences? I would say the convergence, I would say with Putin and Israel is we're not in the Soviet era anymore. That was the height of anti-Semitism where they didn't even have diplomatic relations with Israel. Putin is very happy that there's 1 million Jews in Israel who speak Russian, and they come back and forth for business, and he's proud of that. He thinks that also that that they're like goodwill ambassadors for Russia, and maybe even the American Jewish community likes the fact that he's got good ties with Jews. So Putin has been careful to have good ties with Israel. And when his first trip, he basically deconflicts. The word deconfliction is jargon. It just means you don't want your planes crashing into each other over Syria. And that what Putin has wanted is just to say, what Israel has said is, look, you're running the skies of Syria, but if you go by news reports, and I'm not here to comment above news reports, it does seem often that the Israeli strikes are from Lebanese airspace or from Tiberias inside Israel, and that they're standoff rockets, so they don't really ever collide. Although you do have a situation that I'm told that you've got 18-year-old girls whose parents are from Russia, made Aliyah from the former Soviet Union, Russia, And when they have to deconflict, you have 18-year-old Israeli girls who speak Russian from their family, talking to their Russian, counterparts to coordinate. But basically, the Russia piece of this is that they want good ties with Israel, and that's why Netanyahu has made 7 trips. But they also give weaponry to the Iranians, and who often gives weaponry to Hezbollah. And Israel has complained and said, hey, you're trying to have it on both sides. And they say, yes. And we do. That's it. We're trying to have it from both ends. Now, does Putin have other calculations? He clearly does. That this is a prestige thing that Russia's returned to the Middle East, having been absent really since the 1970s, when the Soviet military advisors were kicked out of Egypt in 1972. Yes. Does he want to trade Syria for the Ukraine? I don't believe that's a trade any American is going to make, but he might harbor those kinds of ambitions. We don't know. But what it is interesting is that Russia and Iran don't have identical interests. They are both allies because of the arms relationship, and they have a common project, keep Bashar in power in Damascus, but they're also competitors in Syria. And I guess you'd call that frenemies, friends and enemies. They're frenemies. And Israel's hoping that they would be able to drive a wedge so that to say, hey, you might have had a common purpose during the war, but if you look at the post-war, you've got more divergences than convergences with Iran, and your interests are not with them. You don't want a war. You don't want them to win. You don't want them to have a naval base. You don't want them to have an air base in Syria. That's for you, not for them. And to be fair to Russia, well, I'm very skeptical of Putin. I will say that he has denied them the ability to have those air bases and naval bases. And the Israelis have made their case, and the Israelis have been successful. But it's easier for them to deny permission to Iran than it is to say, oh, we'll strike military infrastructure of Iran. That Putin is not going to do for Israel. Once again, Israel is all alone. So will there be a way to drive them apart? It's unclear to me that will happen completely. But Putin does not want a war that puts him in the middle of this. So what could be done here? What could be done is to try to explore, for example, could the U.S. and Russia work together to have a red line agreement in Syria and say, look, we're not going to be able to push Iran out of Syria, but the things that Israel cares for the most are no naval ports, no air bases, no military infrastructure, no missiles, no Shia proxies coming down to the south near the Israeli border. That might be something the U.S. and Russia could do together. The one project they've actually worked on together has been what's called a deconfliction zone in the south, and that impacts Jordan too. And Jordan is an ally of Israel. Again, it's hard to use those words, but yes, Israel and Jordan are not just have a peace treaties. Israel has given Cobra helicopters to Jordan to help it fight off ISIS. It wants to keep Iran far away from, and Hezbollah away from Jordan's border. So there's been this effort to try to keep Hezbollah in the south, but right now it has been very feeble, I would say. It's 5 miles from the point of conflict, 5 kilometers even less than 5 miles. So, but could it be expanded to like a U.S.-Russia red line agreement in Syria that would tamp down the prospects of war? That to me would be the best. The problem is that the U.S.-Russia dynamic, if you watch CNN every night and everything, you see because of all the terrible things that Putin has done with the American elections, and I know a lot of this is allegations, but there's a lot of meddling here that I think are pretty clear that it's hard to get any goodwill to work on any world hotspot. But because I think the next war could come from Syria, I do hope there's a way to deconflict even greater, to have a red line agreement. So we'll have to see. Could there be peace talks between between all these different factions, and it's blizzardly complicated. It's like playing more than 6-dimensional chess. It might be 15-dimensional chess. Maybe, but it's hard for me to see, is Assad, what's in it for him to step aside? I was in Europe in December. I met with the foreign offices in London, Paris, Brussels, Berlin, at the top level. And they all said, look, Putin is knocking down our door. He wants us to fork over billions of dollars to build Syria. We're not going to do it until we know that Assad is stepping aside. Putin wants to show, he just had a so-called election in March, that he has already won the war and they're already starting reconstruction. He wants to show his own people in Russia that. But the Europeans saying, the war isn't over yet. And we don't think Assad has won, and we don't want to put billions of dollars to give to Bashar Al Assad, who's then going to gas his own people. This does not look good for Europe. So it's very complicated. I'll end on a hopeful note. And I know after all this, he's like, okay, what's the hope? The hope is an unusual convergence that has not happened in history between Israel and Sunni Arabs. That we saw MBS, the Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince gave an interview to The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg last week, where he was asked, and he said, look, both the Israelis and the Arabs, the Palestinians have a right to a homeland. No Arab leader has ever talked about Israel having rights. They kind of say Israel exists, we got to deal with reality. But not that Israel or Jews have a right to anything. This is new. And it isn't just that. There have been a lot of things under the table, so to speak, that have brought Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates closer because of their fear of Iran. And we hear that MBS also is saying that if there's peace, we in Saudi Arabia will benefit from Israeli technology. That's also revolutionary that we've never heard. That the people talk about all the technology gains from the future and not just the military security dimension. So to have a 32-year-old leader in Saudi Arabia who's talking about how do we build peace? How do we use technology for our benefit? That's a real shift. The head of the Saudi World Muslim Congress, who used to deny the Holocaust, it said the Anne Frank diary is a forgery, and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, though, is true, when that's a clear forgery back from the Tsarist period. And he's now saying there really was a Holocaust. It's one of the worst atrocities in the history of the world. There's a Saudi justice minister, who was the justice minister, now runs the Saudi Congress. This is like this is a revolution that all of a sudden the Sunnis are realizing the Israelis are not our enemies. They're our potential allies. And that we have never seen before. Only in 2018, it started percolating in the last few years, and it's popping up a little bit over the table. It's not yet fully above the table. There's no Saudi embassy in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv because the Palestinian issue, and that's the glass ceiling, if you will. But the point that the Saudis are saying, it's in our interest as Saudi Arabia. This isn't a favor to America, but we want peace with Israel. This is a revolutionary thing. And the same with the Emirates, and there's business things going on under the table there. And like Egypt, Israel and Jordan. I've joked with Moshe Alon, the former defense minister of Israel, who I know, and I said, and apparently he uses it in his speeches now, I said Israel's become the first Sunni state to be Jewish. It's a revolution. Now Israel's about to have its 70th birthday at the end of April in the Hebrew calendar, May in the American calendar, the solar calendar. But it is an amazing time of hope. So I realize why this talk was about all the gloom. What I wonder is if there was only a way that all this coming together under the table is going to lead to some benefits for people above the table in Syria, where there's been so much suffering. And the chemical weaponry is just the latest of that. I would like to wonder if the Sunnis in Israel could come together on Syria. Now, I don't know. It's clear the Sunnis want regime change. They don't want a minority regime of Bashar Al Assad. Nobody wants him because of all the gassing and the butchering of the people to stay. They're saying, like, why can't there be a different leadership? But Israel can't take that on its shoulders for the reasons I explained. So I think the hopeful ending here is that there are alliances now in 2018 that if I'd be talking about this in 2013, maybe when you first started this lecture series, you'd say, David, you're on drugs. There's no way. But yes way is that these new relationships are coming together. And what I'm always looking for, that silver lining of where can we create new relationships that could avert what I fear is the prospect for war in 2018. Thank you all very, very much.